Have you ever noticed that the moment you stop chasing someone, they suddenly begin paying attention to you? The messages start appearing. The curiosity grows. The person who once seemed distant now seems unexpectedly interested. At first, it feels confusing, even unfair. Why would someone value you only after you've stepped back? Most people assume it's coincidence, but beneath this pattern lies a psychological principle that quietly shapes friendships, relationships, workplaces, and even social status. Human desire rarely follows logic. Instead, it is influenced by perception, uncertainty, and emotional value. The harder people try to force attention, the less valuable they often appear. Yet those who remain emotionally grounded and independent frequently become the ones others can't stop thinking about. This isn't about manipulation or playing mind games. It's about understanding how the human mind naturally responds to scarcity, mystery, and emotional independence. The biggest mistake people make is believing that more effort always creates more attraction. In reality, excessive pursuit can unintentionally reduce curiosity instead of increasing it. In this video, you'll discover why people often begin chasing what they once ignored, how absence changes perception, why emotional independence creates quiet influence, and how understanding these hidden psychological patterns can completely transform the way others respond to you. The human mind has a curious habit. It often places greater value on what feels difficult to obtain than on what is freely available. This pattern appears everywhere, in relationships, friendships, careers, and even in the goals people choose to pursue. It is not always the object itself that becomes valuable, but the effort and uncertainty surrounding it. When someone is constantly available, their presence gradually becomes predictable. Predictability brings comfort, but it can also reduce curiosity. The mind adapts quickly to what it sees every day, treating it as part of the background rather than something worthy of special attention. This doesn't mean consistency is wrong. It simply means that constant availability can unintentionally make people overlook what they already have. Scarcity changes perception. When access becomes limited, the brain begins asking questions it never asked before. Why are they no longer here? Have I underestimated their importance? Could I lose something valuable? These questions create emotional tension, and that tension naturally increases focus. Suddenly, the person who seemed ordinary begins occupying more mental space than before. Another powerful psychological tendency is that people often confuse difficulty with importance. If something requires patience, effort, or uncertainty, the mind may automatically assign it greater value. This is why achievements earned through hard work often feel more meaningful than those gained effortlessly. The same principle can influence how people perceive other people. Perhaps the strongest force at work is the fear of loss. People frequently ignore what is present until they sense it may disappear. The possibility of losing access creates an emotional response that simple availability rarely does. It is not always love or deep attachment that awakens in that moment. It is awareness. What was once taken for granted suddenly becomes visible. Understanding this pattern is not about becoming distant or withholding yourself. It is about recognizing that genuine self-respect and a full, independent life naturally create a sense of value. People are often drawn not to those who chase attention, but to those whose lives remain meaningful even when no one is watching. One of the most powerful shifts in human psychology begins the moment you stop trying to convince someone to notice you. As long as you are constantly explaining yourself, seeking reassurance, or fighting for someone's attention, you leave very little room for their own mind to become engaged. Every answer is provided before a question has the chance to form. But silence changes everything. When your messages become less frequent, when your attention is no longer constantly available, something unexpected often happens. The other person's mind begins searching for explanations. They wonder what changed. They replay past conversations. They start looking for meaning where they once paid little attention. This is not because silence has magical power, but because the human brain naturally dislikes unanswered questions. Curiosity is often far more powerful than persuasion. The harder someone tries to prove their value, the less space they leave for others to discover that value on their own. Discovery creates a stronger emotional impact than explanation, because people tend to trust conclusions they reach themselves. When they become curious, they willingly invest their own thoughts and emotions into finding the answer. This is also why unfinished stories stay with us. A conversation left unresolved, a relationship that suddenly becomes quiet, or a familiar presence that unexpectedly disappears can occupy the mind for much longer than something that feels completely predictable. The brain seeks closure, and until it finds it, it often returns to the same questions again and again. Absence strengthens this effect because imagination begins filling the empty spaces. Without constant updates or reassurance, people naturally create their own interpretations. Sometimes they remember your best qualities more vividly than they did when you were always present. Sometimes they realize your importance only after your attention is no longer guaranteed. The lesson is not to use silence as a strategy for manipulation. The deeper principle is that genuine confidence allows space for others to think, reflect, and appreciate your presence without being pressured. Often, the moment you stop chasing is the moment their mind finally has the opportunity to notice what was there all along. Attention is one of the most valuable resources people possess, yet few realize how much influence it carries. Every conversation, every message, and every moment of focus is an exchange. Whether we notice it or not, people are constantly deciding where to invest their attention, because attention is closely connected to time, energy, and emotional commitment. The more freely it is given without boundaries, the more easily it can be overlooked. This is why constant attention often removes mystery. When someone always knows they can reach you, always expects an immediate response, or never has to wonder what you're doing, there is little left for curiosity to explore. Predictability creates certainty, and while certainty can build trust, excessive predictability can also make your presence feel routine rather than remarkable. The mind naturally pays closer attention to what it cannot fully predict. Emotional independence quietly changes the way people perceive you. Someone who enjoys their own life, pursues meaningful goals, and does not rely on constant validation sends a powerful, unspoken message. Their self-worth is not controlled by other people's reactions. That quiet confidence often speaks louder than endless attempts to impress others. It isn't arrogance or emotional distance. It is the ability to remain steady, whether attention is given or withheld. People also tend to respect those who do not beg for approval. Approval that is demanded loses much of its value, while confidence that exists without permission often earns genuine admiration. Individuals who know their values, maintain healthy boundaries, and refuse to sacrifice their self-respect simply to be liked often leave a stronger impression than those who constantly seek acceptance. Beneath every social interaction lies an invisible hierarchy shaped by attention. Those who desperately chase it often end up giving away their emotional power, while those who use their attention with intention naturally create greater respect. The real lesson is not to withhold attention as a tactic, but to recognize its worth. When your attention becomes something you give with purpose rather than desperation, people begin to value it differently, and in many cases, they begin to value you differently as well. Human beings naturally seek patterns. Once someone becomes accustomed to your behavior, they begin to form silent expectations about how you will respond. They expect you to answer quickly, to initiate conversations, to make the first move after an argument, or to always be emotionally available. Over time, these expectations stop feeling like possibilities and start feeling like guarantees. Without realizing it, people become comfortable believing they know exactly what you will do next. The moment those expectations are broken, the mind reacts. If the person who always reaches out suddenly becomes quiet, or the one who constantly seeks approval begins focusing on their own life, uncertainty replaces certainty. That uncertainty often creates anxiety, not necessarily because something bad has happened, but because the familiar pattern has disappeared. The human brain is wired to notice change, especially when that change affects relationships and emotional security. Emotional certainty can quietly become addictive. When someone always knows they have your attention, your reassurance, or your willingness to stay regardless of how they behave, they stop questioning whether you'll be there. Your consistency becomes something they unconsciously rely on. But when that certainty is no longer guaranteed, they are forced to think about your value in a way they never had before. Another hidden force is the feeling of losing influence. People often enjoy the comfort of believing they can predict or shape another person's actions. When they discover they no longer have that certainty, it can feel like a loss of control. They may reach out more often, become unusually curious, or pay closer attention, not because they suddenly changed overnight, but because the dynamic itself has changed. The lesson isn't that you should become unpredictable to manipulate others. Instead, it is that your life should never revolve around meeting someone else's expectations at the expense of your own growth. Healthy relationships are built on mutual respect, not on one person always playing the same role. When you develop emotional independence and stop acting from fear of losing others, you naturally change the balance of the relationship. And sometimes it is only when the old pattern disappears that people finally recognize the value of the person they thought would always remain the same. There is a quiet truth about human nature that many people only recognize too late. What is constantly present is often taken for granted. When someone becomes a permanent part of another person's daily life, their kindness, loyalty, and attention can slowly blend into the background. Not because they have become less valuable, but because the human mind quickly adapts to consistency. What was once appreciated eventually begins to feel ordinary. This is why absence can reveal what presence sometimes hides. When you are no longer there to send the message, offer encouragement, or simply occupy the familiar space you once filled, people are forced to experience that empty space for the first time. It is often in that silence that they begin to recognize how much your presence contributed to their emotional world. Distance has a way of exposing emotional dependence that constant closeness can easily conceal. Another fascinating psychological pattern is that memory rarely acts like a perfect recording. Instead, it edits reality. As time passes, the mind naturally filters experiences, allowing meaningful moments to stand out, while many of the small frustrations begin to fade. This is why people often remember your patience, your humor, your support, or the sense of comfort you brought, long after the everyday disagreements have disappeared from focus. Delayed appreciation is more common than most people realize. Many individuals only understand the importance of a person after they are no longer easily accessible. The absence creates comparison. They begin measuring current experiences against what they once had, and only then do they recognize qualities they previously overlooked. The lesson, however, is not to disappear simply to make someone miss you. Genuine value should never depend on creating artificial distance. Instead, understand that your worth does not decrease simply because someone fails to recognize it in the moment. The right people often appreciate consistency while it exists, but even when they don't, your value remains unchanged. True confidence comes from knowing that your presence is meaningful, not because others suddenly realize it after you're gone, but because you have built a life, a character, and a sense of self that hold value regardless of who notices. Strength is often misunderstood. Many people believe that proving their love, explaining themselves repeatedly, or fighting endlessly for someone's attention is a sign of commitment. But true strength rarely announces itself so loudly. More often, it appears as emotional self-control, the ability to remain calm, composed, and secure even when circumstances become uncertain. Emotional self-control creates a quiet confidence that others can immediately sense. It is the difference between reacting impulsively and responding with intention. When your emotions are no longer controlled by someone else's approval or rejection, you begin to project stability. And stability is something people naturally trust and respect. This is where many people confuse detachment with rejection. Genuine detachment does not mean becoming cold, indifferent, or emotionally unavailable. It means understanding that your happiness, identity, and self-worth are not dependent on another person's choices. You can care deeply about someone without allowing your peace of mind to rise and fall with their behavior. That kind of balance is not weakness, it is emotional maturity. True confidence also has no need to constantly seek validation. It doesn't chase compliments, demand reassurance, or measure its worth through someone else's attention. Instead, It comes from knowing your values, respecting your boundaries, and living in alignment with them. Ironically, people are often drawn toward those who are no longer trying to convince anyone of their value. Calm people possess a quiet magnetism because they are difficult to shake, while others react emotionally to every disappointment or moment of uncertainty. They remain grounded. Their composure communicates something words never could. They have built a life that is not dependent on external approval. The important distinction, however, is between playing games and having standards. Playing games is an attempt to manipulate another person's emotions. Having standards is an act of self-respect. One is driven by fear of losing someone, while the other is guided by the belief that healthy relationships require mutual effort, honesty, and respect. In the end, the strongest person is never the one who chases every opportunity to be chosen. It is the one who has already chosen to value themselves first. After understanding these psychological patterns, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The goal was never to make people chase you. That is merely a byproduct. The real transformation begins when you stop organizing your life around someone else's attention and start building a life that feels meaningful on its own. One of the greatest mistakes people make is believing they can control how others feel. They analyze every message, replay every conversation, and change their personality in hopes of becoming impossible to ignore. But human emotions cannot be controlled with perfect words or endless effort. The more desperately you try to influence someone's feelings, the more control you give away over your own. Real influence begins with emotional freedom. When your happiness no longer depends on being chosen, approved of, or constantly reassured, something changes inside you. You stop reacting from fear and begin acting from purpose. Your decisions become guided by your values instead of your insecurities. People notice this shift because genuine confidence cannot be manufactured. It grows naturally from a life that has direction. Purpose has a quiet power. A person who is deeply invested in learning, creating, improving, and living according to their principles carries an energy that cannot be imitated. They are not difficult to reach because they are playing games. They are simply busy building a life that matters. Their attention becomes valuable because it is given intentionally, not desperately. Emotional freedom also changes every relationship. You begin appreciating people instead of depending on them. You choose connections based on mutual respect rather than fear of being alone. That shift removes pressure from your relationships and replaces it with authenticity. Ironically, this is often when people become more curious about you, not because you withdrew to manipulate them, but because your confidence is no longer asking for permission to exist. So if there is one lesson to remember from this video, let it be this. The most attractive person in any room is rarely the one trying hardest to be noticed. It is the one whose sense of worth comes from within, whose life has purpose beyond approval, and whose peace cannot be purchased with attention. The day you stop chasing validation is the day you begin attracting genuine respect. And perhaps the greatest victory isn't that someone finally decides to chase you. It is realizing that your happiness no longer depends on whether they do.